Hi, I'm Jeremy Goldman.
And I'm Kieran Chetry, and this is Future Proof.
Okay, and today we are really excited about the inevitably nerdy conversation we're about to have with Greg McNeal, the co-founder of AirMap. Actually, should I call you Greg or Gregory?
Yeah, Greg's fine. Some people call me Gregory, but it's mostly my wife and my mother when I'm in trouble.
That's great. My wife has a cute nickname for me when I'm in trouble. She just calls me Schmuck. So yeah, I think I like the way that you get treated a little better than me. But
well, I can't say my other nickname I guess I could say it on a podcast, but I certainly couldn't say it on radio.
Yeah, I know that's the joys of podcasting. So so I mean, just to give everybody a little bit of an intro to Greg. He's an expert in tech, law, and public policy, all things that everybody needs to know more about, pay more attention to. He's also a professor at Pepperdine University and a frequent keynote speaker about unmanned aircraft and innovation policy. So basically, if you need to know anything about drones, he's your guy. Tell me a little bit more about some of your experience and kind of how you got to where you are today, especially with respect to drones.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of life story. I won't give the whole thing, but when I was in high school, I went to a special magnet school in New Jersey called High Technology High School, which was focused on the internet and engineering. And this was the 90s. So to focus on those types of things was sort of remarkable for a school. Then I got into college. I was really the first in my family to go to college. So I had an Army ROTC scholarship, and I wasn't really expecting to be able to go to, I went to Lehigh University. I wasn't expecting to be able to go to a really good school. It was because of the finances of our family. We thought I was going to go to community college. But I got the Army ROTC scholarship, and I thought, I'm going in the Army, so I shouldn't do this tech stuff. I should focus on, international relations and politics, so I know something about the world I'm going into. And then the Army, in its wisdom, looked at my international relations degree and said, you should be what they call a signal officer, so a person who's in charge of communications and technology. And so someone was trying to nudge me back on course. And so my first job out of college, I was in charge of 46 soldiers and 16 civilians running internet and telephone and telecommunications in Korea. And then I came back to the United States and did that. So then I kind of nudged away from tech, and I said, I'm going to go into public policy. I got a master's in public policy and administration. I like the law. So I decided to go to law school. And then when I was in law school, I had a professor come up to me and said, who knew I had an Army background, said, I want you to be my research assistant. I'm doing all of this research on drones on the battlefield. So I became something of an expert on that by working with him. And when I got out of law school, I did some work with the government, and then started focusing my research on drones initially on the battlefield. And then I started going to these conferences about battlefield drones, and people started saying, wait until these things come to the United States. It's going to be really exciting. And I was thinking to myself, I don't know that drones dropping bombs is an exciting thing I want coming to the United States, but I knew there was something there, and I had this Evernote folder that I was keeping. So I started looking back at that research, and then all of a sudden in 2012, I was maybe 5-6 years in on being a drone guy, and the FAA passed the FAA Modernization and Reform Act, which basically, the Congress passed the FAA Modernization and Reform Act, which basically said, FAA, figure out how to allow drones to fly in the United States. And my phone started ringing off the hook because I was known as a drone person, and I started consulting with startups and companies doing civilian drone work, and then ultimately met up with my co-founder, and we founded AirMap. And instead of advising companies on drone policy, I started working with a company that developing drone technology. So that's sort of the 3-minute once over the world to how you get into founding a drone company as a law professor.
I think that's a great name for an article. How to start a drone company as a law professor? Because I think that that's a very unique skill set. Do you ever kind of think about how there are probably not that many people with that exact background that you have out there?
It is, it's certainly a unique background. And the interesting thing about aviation policy and transportation policy is that really aviation policy, there's no industry more heavily regulated than aviation, save for maybe space or the nuclear industry. And so, Silicon Valley talks a lot about disrupting heavily regulated industries. But when you get to an industry that's as heavily regulated as this, I think we've witnessed, certainly at AirMap, we've witnessed a lot of companies crash on the rocks of the regulatory environment, because there's sort of a mentality in Silicon Valley where, like, if you develop this solution and you show it to people, the wisdom of your idea and your solution is going to win them over. And that's just simply not how government works, and certainly not heavily regulated industries. And so you really need to have an approach to heavily regulated industries that allows you to recognize the constraints that the government faces, even if they want to work with you, as well as the sort of timeline limitations on your ability to enter the market. And with drones, it's not only the federal government, but there are also state and local governments that are involved, which is a difference that nobody had ever really expected in aviation before, but we had anticipated early on. So it's been a competitive advantage for us to have knowledge of the regulatory environment. And I would think that would be true in other environments where technology is trying to disrupt health or food or other heavily regulated industries. I think it's an essential component to a winning business strategy.
So, I actually want to ask you a little bit about that, because to some extent that was kind of leaning into one of my lightning round questions. So maybe we can jump into the lightning round now really quick. What's your favorite drone or robot character from any movie ever?
That's a tough one. Probably the first one that comes to mind is Data from Star Trek: The Next Generation, right? So practically human, he's probably the favorite character that jumps to mind for me if you think about it intellectually and like on a complexity level, as opposed to sort of R2-D2, who's sort of, the mascot of the Star Wars series.
Okay, so that's a good one. What is the dorkiest thing about you, apart from the fact that you've devoted your life to drones?
Comic books, my comic book collection, my nonstop references in my teaching to comic book characters, to the point where, like, when we started building our policy team at AirMap, I wanted a person to be hired, and the job description I had in mind was Watchtower, which Watchtower comic book series. Watchtower is like the name of the Justice League headquarters when it finds itself in space. And so the idea was we would have a person in the company who was really sort of a head of policy operations, tracking documents and to-dos and people we were talking to and narratives we were hearing, to figure out how to either work with those people or change their mind with regard to the benefits of drones. And that person would be sort of aiding our superheroes who are in the field, our policy managers. And so that kind of, to give you an idea of the depth of geekery there, that's the comic book, kid inside me, integrating those things into business and consulting and my teaching. It's,
I gotta say, and I'm probably one of the bigger comic book fans ever, so we'll have to have a side conversation about that. But when you said Watchtower, I knew you were going to go Justice League, and I think I probably should do that. I think the conference rooms at Firebrand, we should be naming after everybody in the Green Lantern Corps. Best way you keep abreast of the latest in drone technology?
I think the real way to understand things is to be interacting with colleagues on the industry side, but also interacting with potential partners on the state, local, and federal government side. And if you're not paying attention to all of those dimensions, and then really a third dimension for us now is to duplicate that at the international level. If you're not doing that, you're missing something, and that becomes a full-time job. And just, I know this is lightning round, but just like a little tangent off of that, I think that's an essential component of what companies that are trying to enter heavily regulated industries need to do. They need a person whose full-time job is to be monitoring all of those developments so they can understand the way the industry is going to take shape and the way that stakeholders are responding to how the industry is taking shape.
That's a really good point. And then the last question I had is, if you could pilot a drone to anywhere in the world, if there were no regulations whatsoever, so obviously we're not talking about breaking any rules here, but if there were no rules, where would you pilot that drone?
Ooh, so this is going outside of aerial drones, which is what we typically think of. But I think the most fascinating opportunities for drones are in unmanned underwater vehicles, at least on Earth, and going to the deepest parts of the ocean where no submarine could ever go to discover what kind of life we haven't learned about yet is on the surface of the ocean at its deepest points. And so that to me is the most fascinating, and the barrier is not legal or regulatory. The barrier is building something strong enough to be able to survive that journey.
Oh, that's great. That is not what I expected, but that's pretty awesome. So I think just to kind of dive back into the idea about the mission of AirMap in general, I know that your mission is to make drones part of everyday life by really building the airspace services platform that lets innovation take flight. I'm wondering, can you dumb that down for us?
Sure. Yeah, I can give some simple, concrete examples. And so when you think about your everyday life, let's take someone in a typical suburbia. Not a New Yorker who walks for amazing pizza and coffee, but maybe someone who lives in a subdivision. They've got a front lawn, they have a backyard, it has a fence around it. They get up to work and they take their commute every day, and they drive 20 minutes to a Target or a Walmart. You think about their life and their journey throughout the day. So, in the morning, they back in the day when newspapers were delivered, maybe they pick up a paper in the morning. They also get a package delivered by UPS. Their roof on their home needs to be inspected from time to time, or their neighbor's roof needs to be inspected. Someone in the neighborhood is selling a home. And each of the things that I've talked about are things that can be done better or more efficiently or more cheaply or more safely with a drone. So the roof inspection today, someone climbs up on a roof and they take a ladder, they go up on the roof, and they're inspecting tiles or shingles on the roof, trying to find leaks. And every year, someone slides off of a roof and seriously injures themselves, so that they can look at a tile up close. Today, companies we're working with, like Kespri, they get up into the air and they can put a drone over that roof and in 20 minutes get the same information that a person might get in 45 minutes on the roof without ever jeopardizing that person's life. Similarly, someone wants to take pictures of a home to sell it today. Now they can do that with a drone that'll get really great imagery of what the area around that home looks like. And so you imagine those myriad uses, and of course the package delivery instead of the UPS. You imagine those myriad uses today where it's a person who walks to the lawn, puts the drone down, flies it up, and flies it within line of sight. They're slightly more efficient because it's a 20-minute job instead of a 45-minute job. But you lose the efficiency of the fact that the person needs to drive their vehicle out there and put the drone down and conduct the inspection on site. The future that becomes really exciting and efficient for us is the future where that drone leaves from a predetermined location en route to conduct an inspection or to do the real estate photography. And so that autonomous drone on demand heads to a job site. But for that drone to be able to do that, that drone needs to be able to get from point A to point B, navigating hazards, navigating other air traffic, navigating around things like power plants and utilities and schoolyards where there are lots of children, without a pilot on board, really knowing the world around it based on either data that it has ahead of time or data that it needs to gather along the way. Our platform is what allows the drone to be able to know that. We provide information about the static things like power plants and police stations and fire and nuclear energy and power lines. But we also provide dynamic information. Like imagine that the route from A to B is a route that's good every day, except for today because the local hardware store is on fire and that local hardware store is between point A and point B. The drone needs to know that ahead of time before navigating there. And we have systems that interface with the police department and the fire department to let you know that there's a fire there today to tell the operator so that they don't interfere, but really the long-term plan to make sure that that drone doesn't autonomously fly itself through a place it shouldn't be at. So those are just some of the components of what we do before I even talk about the air traffic control components and the safety and the routing.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get to all of those things. I think I wanted to, in some ways, also just piggyback off of what you were saying, because to me, what's interesting is that there's a lot of misconceptions about drone technology, about what it means for us. And it seems like every day I hear about people who are a little bit wary of drone tech becoming a greater part of our society. But is there any common misconceptions that you often run into in your work where you kind of have to set the record straight about what drones are and what they are not?
Yeah, there are quite a few. I mean, when we talk about drones today, for a long time, the misconception was that we were talking about predators and reapers and battlefield drones, to the point where 3 years ago, the Wi-Fi password at AUVSI, which was the drone industry's trade show, the Wi-Fi password was "don't call it a drone," because the industry was convinced that all of their problems were because people were calling it a drone. And I actually wrote a piece at Forbes about that and said it's a silly notion. The reason people have concerns with drones aren't because you're calling them a drone. It's because they're concerned about nuisance, privacy, trespass, and other issues related to the drone. And so now, though, if you just consider 3 years later, the FAA refers to their advisory committee as the Drone Advisory Committee. So it's not about the name. It's about certain types of ideas that people have in their head related to drones.
Yeah, and I think that education, what we see, especially in all of my work, a lot of it is a matter of just people have to be educated. If you confront people with actual facts, then facts do kind of wind up winning out to a large extent. So I think that that's definitely a good point. I mean, what do you think about the fact that, like, I think for me, this is one of the top things I hear is that people are concerned about jobs lost. The jobs lost or the perception of jobs displaced as a result of growth in drone technology. How valid of a concern do you think that is? And is it something that should be a concern in 2018 or 2028 or 2038 or never?
I think the job loss concern is less valid than the job displacement or replacement concern. One example I like to use is the example of you think of a person now who maybe their job is to work for the State Department of Environmental Protection. And on any given day, they'll get in sort of the state EPA pickup truck, and they'll go out and they'll take water samples from a few places along a watershed to determine whether or not there are certain numbers of pollutants in the water. And then they'll bring that water sample back and they'll analyze the data, and then they'll realize that they found something. And then the next day they'll continue to sort of spot check in a particular area. That job might go away with drones, where the person who would typically go out and take the water sample is instead staying at the lab, and the drone is going out and not taking 3 or 4 water samples, but every day taking water samples up and down a river from a variety of places, gathering massive amounts of data instead of spot samples of data. And the person who's scooping water, that job might go away, but it'll be replaced by the need for many, many more analysts to be able to understand what's going on in that location. And then because we have better insight into the environmental pollution, we might see an increase in the number of jobs that are seeking to mitigate the impact of those harms. Similarly, the person who climbs the roof, their job might be replaced by someone who works in the rear as an analyst, watching those roof inspections on a computer and helping to deal with the customer to set them up to fix that problem before it becomes a big leak in their home, right? So early anticipation of maintenance problems. And so I think net, what we'll see is the manual tasks, the dull and dirty tasks, will be replaced with analytical tasks. And so I think it'll actually create more jobs, just like when ATM machines came out, the number of banking jobs increased because a person who was counting numbers went away, and banks replaced those people with people who were interacting with customers, helping them, experience the bank in a way where they could access other products at the bank.
Often I hear this argument from subject matter experts, and this is not to be combative, of course. It's just everybody, I feel like, has incentives to say that there will be a little bit more in the way of jobs being created. I kind of agree with you personally, especially with the sector that we're talking about now. But I just think it's interesting because how does one even know or forecast exactly whether or not there are going to be more or they're going to be less? It could be that it's not 1-to-1. It could be 1-to-2, or it could be 2-to-1. And it seems like there's nobody's necessarily the watchdog at the end of the day to figure out, are there going to be more jobs or less jobs as a result of drone technology? I think we just look at it and say, from an efficiency and progress standpoint, it is something that is going to happen. So it might as well happen as quickly and efficiently as possible. And that's kind of, I feel like, where AirMac comes in.
Yeah, I had a really fascinating conversation with Mayor Edwin Lee, the late Mayor Edwin Lee of San Francisco, about this exact point. We were at a dinner and I was chatting with him, and he said, our big concern in San Francisco is the job displacement. That's a very progressive concern for the folks in San Francisco to have. And we had this really good conversation because Mayor Lee, it's why I love him so much and kind of miss him, is he was a good listener, and he said almost the exact same thing that you said, which is, I hear some people on one side say the jobs are going to go away. I hear people on the other side say that we'll have an increase in jobs. And his point was, I don't know that I can predict either way, but I know for certain that the types of jobs we will have will change. So how do I prepare my community for the fact that if there are new jobs, those new jobs may be different jobs, and how do I prepare people to be equipped to go into those types of jobs if they didn't have the skill set today that's necessary for it? And I think that is at the heart of the policy question, because we can't really predict with certainty the net gain or the net loss, but I think we can all predict that the jobs will be different, just like the jobs are different now than they were before the internet.
You hit the nail on the head as to why we call the show Future Proof, which is that these things are going to happen. There are certain things that are going to wind up having a major impact on our worlds. And the best way to future-proof yourself is to understand where these changes are going to occur and figure out how to address them and get ahead of them, rather than kind of sticking your head in the sand. Because what good does that do you or your business to not be prepared when you have a competitor who does keep abreast of the latest changes and who does understand that, for instance, drone technology might be a little bit more usable and might be going more mainstream than the average person thinks. I mean, where do you think that we are in terms of the overall life cycle of drone technology? Obviously, we're pretty early on.
To make a historical analogy, back in the 1920s, what happened in the United States as airplanes were taking flight were that the navigational aids to tell airplanes where to fly to, and the rules for what airports needed to look like, and the rules for altitude at which you could fly, et cetera. All of that stuff was undeveloped. In fact, it wasn't really developed in the United States until the 40s and 50s. The FAA hasn't. I think the FAA, came about in the late 40s, right? So we haven't had a very long period of time with manned aviation. And I'd say we're at that period of time in the early, what some people call the barnstorming days when it comes to drones. And just go back to that, what I was talking about earlier about the drone that needs to navigate through the local, suburban area. There's all kinds of information that needs to be known about that city. And there are companies that are installing beacons on light posts, because you can survey and know the exact GPS location of a light post. And so if you put a beacon on that light post, it helps autonomous cars and drones so autonomous vehicles in the air and on the ground, know their exact location in physical space, especially in urban areas where it's tough for GPS signals to get down because you have what are known as GPS canyons. You'll need new radio technology in the form of cellular technology in those local communities, because most of these things will be powered by the internet. And so you'll need installations of all of that new technology. And so there's a whole new infrastructure that needs to be laid for autonomous vehicles on the ground and autonomous vehicles in the air. And we haven't laid that infrastructure yet. And that's just talking about knowing things in physical space. What about the data exchange between a drone as it is approaching another drone? This is what AirMap is building. And then a drone, when it's approaching another manned aircraft, it's also something that AirMap's building. And then how does that information get exchanged between the AirMap system, the Google system, the Amazon system, and hundreds of other systems that are trying to power the Walmart fleet and the Target fleet and the local pizza delivery fleet?
An episode we had where with executive editor of Motor Trend magazine, Mark Recton, and we were talking about this very same topic, which is the fact that the infrastructure, the technology might be there, but if the infrastructure isn't there, then that can be a huge hurdle. And it kind of got me thinking in some ways. I know you're talking about regulations there, and to me, I put that in the same bucket as standardization. So meaning if you have, it was interesting what you were talking about, if you have different states that have different rules, to me, that seems like that's a little bit of a problem that has to be solved, or we need a little bit better standards in terms of what you can do and what you can't do. It just seems that generally, whenever you have a lack of standardization or the same rules everywhere, that's just a major barrier to something progressing as quickly as it could. And I'm wondering if you agree or disagree, and if you think that there should just be one big federal rule, one big international rule, or where do you think that that's going to likely go and wind up?
Yeah, I personally in AirMap, we have a more nuanced view on this than our colleagues in the rest of industry. So I'd say most of industry thinks that there should be one big federal preemptive rule, which is the approach that aviation has typically taken. Our view is a little more nuanced on that. We want to see standardization of rules across state borders, but we recognize that downtown Manhattan is different than Manhattan, Kansas. And so we look at it more in the ways that we look at surface transportation than manned aviation. And so the standardization in surface transportation comes out of the Department of Transportation. That's through for example, their manual for uniform traffic control devices. It says that if you're going to make a stop sign, it's a red octagon. I think it would be chaos if every state had a different rule for what a stop sign looked like. But whether you put a stop sign at an intersection or a yield sign at an intersection is a decision that's made by, the city of Springfield's planning office, because they understand the local conditions best. They know that that's a particularly fast intersection, or it's near a school and you would want a stop sign there instead of a yield because you're near a school. So I think that standardization and uniformity in what's communicated and what's allowable within that sort of time, manner, place framework is the most important thing we can achieve in the industry, while trusting that local authorities need to be able to make that rule. Then the last piece of complexity that comes in there is how do local entities communicate those rules, because they're not going to put street signs everywhere. I think that's where the data exchange component comes in. When you're thinking about a future with autonomous vehicles, the future you're thinking about is not a vehicle that reads a sign, but instead a vehicle that ingests data. In the same way that when you use Waze, you know that there's a traffic jam up ahead, or Waze knows the speed limit. It knows that because Waze actually has teams that, Google Waze has teams that go out and interface with state governments that make these APIs available with this data available. And we expect a future that's more like that. And we think if we don't have a future that's like that, and the federal government tries to run it out of a federal bureaucracy, we'll never get to a really highly impactful autonomous drone industry, because the agency will collapse under its own weight. We already see it now, where it takes the agency years to get rules out. holding things back, whereas states are able to do these things very quickly.
Obviously, this is something that a lot of people are going to continually watch, but you're right. I think in some ways, this is when you're talking about the U.S. and how the U.S. has developed over time. I mean, we do have a pretty strong cultural feel for having states that have different cultures. And as a result, I almost liken it to say, could drones be the new guns? And I don't mean anything other than it's something that people might feel very strongly about from state to state in terms of this is the way that we want our society to run in relation to society writ large.
Yeah, I mean, there's another example that comes up a lot when I talk to people about this, which is they say, yeah, I want drones and I want package delivery by drone and I want it as fast as possible. And then you sort of start talking to them and they say, but, I don't want my neighbor's kid getting a drone delivery of burritos at 3 a.m, waking up my baby. And so then you ask them the question, who should make that rule regarding what are the allowable takeoff and landing times in residential neighborhoods? And they say, oh, yeah, well, in my local community, they say what times things can happen in residential neighborhoods all the time. But if you had a federal system, it would be the federal government deciding that which neighborhoods get the 9 p.m. curfew and which neighborhoods are industrial zones that are zoned industrial where 24/7 takeoff and landing can happen. And we're not just talking about small drones like the ones we think of today. We could be talking about things that are as large as helicopters in the future or as loud as helicopters in the future. But certainly the 55-pound delivery drones that Google's demonstrated can be heard from hundreds of feet away, and they're pretty loud. And so my sense is that if you said that someone who didn't like what was happening or a residential neighborhood that didn't like what was happening, that they had to call the FAA and go through a 60-day FAA adjudicatory process with a faceless sort of bureaucrat, and multiply that across hundreds of thousands of cities and jurisdictions in the United States, I think most people would not find that to be palatable. They would expect their local elected official would be the person who was accountable, and that person in a federally preempted system would say, sorry, I'm preempted. I can't do anything about it. Talk to the FAA. I just don't see that leading to widespread acceptance of drones. And I think that's really bad for the drone industry.
Talking about regulatory just for one more second, what are other regulatory challenges that we haven't talked about? What, if any, are you following most closely right now, paying a lot of attention to?
Yeah, I served on the FAA's rulemaking committee for remote identification and tracking. So this is one of the biggest accountability challenges. A drone flies over someone's backyard or adjacent to their home, and the person is concerned and doesn't know if the drone is taking pictures of them in their backyard or if it has a weapon or any number of things that go through people's heads. And it just turns out that it's your neighbor getting real estate photography done, which will enhance the value of their property and then by virtue of that, enhance the value of your property. And so the FAA is bringing forth a remote identification and tracking rule that basically will require drones to have a beacon that says that allows their identity to be traced back by government officials so that it's accountable, and also has a historical record of where the drone went, so that if a drone crashes in your backyard or some other harm flows from it, you're able to figure out which drones were in the area. So that's one big thing that's a holdup right now, and it's frankly a holdup to the other regulatory rulemaking committee I was on, which is the flight over people one, because presently drones can't fly directly over people's heads, and so that's really holding back a lot of really good uses for drones, particularly in the news gathering industry and in other industries. So the way the FAA is moving forward on all this is there's a new program, not only on this, but also on the state and local components I told you about, to basically allow the states to create a series of pilot programs to experiment with different ways of using drones for everything from package delivery to inspections and flight over people, and figure out what works best before the FAA makes a permanent rule.
When we're thinking about the future of drone technology in general, is there any particular aspect of drone tech or innovation that's happening within the drone tech world that you're paying close attention to as well?
Yeah, there's a concept called unmanned traffic management in the United States and U-Space in Europe. And this is the critical infrastructure data exchange enabling technology that in the short run will allow drones to fly near airports and fly in places where they're accountable, where areas that previously the government might have said, no, you can't fly here. The technology will now allow the government to say, yes, you can, so long as you request authorization first. So that's one thing that AirMap has produced. It's called LANCE in the FAA terminology. It's called Notice and Authorization and with our partners in Europe. And it's basically you can push a button on your phone or other connected device, request authorization to enter certain airspace, and get immediate authorization back either from a person who's manually doing it or even an automated approval based on certain risk parameters. And we're rolling that out in Europe in the next 2 years, and in the next 3 with the United States. In the United States here with the FAA, we also have programs in Japan and New Zealand that are underway. So that's one technology that's pretty exciting. And the thing that your listeners might not immediately grasp is that if you can do that with a drone and you can deliver a package, eventually that same infrastructure will allow for flying cars to pick people up, on rooftops of downtown urban buildings and avoid, traffic jams getting you from, New York to, LaGuardia or Newark in just a couple minutes.
So I know you have to go in a minute. What's something that people should be paying attention to if they're trying to figure out how drone technology can best be leveraged by their company? What's something that people should be paying attention to or just starting to think about?
Yeah, I think externally to get ideas, they should pay attention to what's going to happen with this IPP program in the United States because it's the most well-received pilot program in the history of the United States government. I don't think that's a President Trump exaggeration. I think the data bears it out. There were hundreds of state, local, and tribal governments that applied to become trial sites for IPP and for UTM. So the IPP is the Integration Pilot Program, and for UTM, Unmanned Traffic Management. So hundreds of state, local, and tribal governments, every state except for one applied, the District of Columbia applied. So, and they required that those public entities have a private entity partner. And there were over 2,500 companies that put themselves on the interested parties list, looking for a date with a public entity so they could do new, exciting things. And so within the next 6 to 12 months, any company that's paying attention to what's going on there will start to see these pilot programs kicking up, and they should try and find a way to match up with their state or local government to do exciting things. So I think that's one of the big things that'll really start to open our eyes. And then internal to a business without having to look externally, I think the thing that businesses should think about are what are the repeatable tasks where I'm sending people to a location to gather some information, to get some imagery, to take a picture, to monitor something, to get a vertical perspective or an aerial perspective on it, or logistics challenges. And those are things that in the next 3 to 4 year time horizon, some as early as right now, can be solved by drones, and some that, about 3 years out could be solved by drones in the logistics category. Just to kind of like make your head spin on one example, I was at a conference where someone presented a drone that would fly to a tower to check whether or not the light at the tower was functioning. And if the light wasn't functioning, the drone had arms that would unscrew the bulb and screw a new bulb on. And so this is on like a radio tower. That kind of thing to me is like mind blowing.
Thank you so much, Greg. This has been really terrific.
Thanks. It's been great being on the show with you. I love the podcast, by the way. I'm listening for, and eagerly anticipating every new episode. So you guys are doing a great job, and thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks again.
Thank you to everybody who's listening right now. Your help and support totally means a lot to us, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Review us on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find out about us. Until next time, I'm Jeremy Goldman, and you've been listening to Future Proof.